Okay, let's get started. And I'm going to begin by introducing myself. I'm Barry Emery. I'll tell you just very briefly that I was a computer teacher at Taconic High School. After I retired, I got interested in Cheshire's history, and it's been a passion ever since. This is actually the 13th summer talk that I've given on some aspects of our history. I've never recorded any in the past, but I've had people tell me I should have, and so I'm going to try recording this one. And I'm recording it using Zoom. I hope my computer picks up my voice, and if you ask questions later, I hope it picks up yours. I hope it picks up the applause that you're all going to give me at the end. So without further ado, let's get started. The questions were intended to focus on what I'm going to be talking about tonight. And I know when I told people I was going to give a talk on Cheshire's prisoner of war camp, everybody wanted to know what war. So let me answer a couple of questions. First of all, the bombardment of Fort McHenry in Maryland, that's when Francis Scott Key wrote the Star-Spangled Banner words. So the answer to that question, which I believe is question number 1, yep, is the War of 1812. He wrote it in 1814. Okay. By the way, he wrote the words. He did not write the music. And from watching the Olympics this summer, I learned that the words are an old drinking song from some pub in England. So the music, I mean, came from a pub in England. All right. The next question I'm going to answer for you is the one about, it's number 7. Much of Maine was captured by the British. Actually, Maine was part of Massachusetts at one time. It was known as the Down East part of Massachusetts, and this kind of circle looks like a boot is actually showing you Massachusetts. And the British invaded part of Maine. And when that happened, the inhabitants of Maine were pretty upset. And so they sent a delegation to Boston to ask Governor Strong if he would send the militia up there to get rid of the British. And Governor Strong said, and they weren't very happy about that. And a few years after the war ended, they petitioned to become their own state, separated from Massachusetts. So the answer to number 7 is the War of 1812. Now, that's the answer to those two. Let's do number 2. Sherman was a famous general. Well, actually, you could say 2 wars. I believe there was a Sherman who crossed Georgia during the Civil War and burned Georgia down. So you could have put Civil War for that. And there may have been a General Sherman in World War I as well. And I don't care what you put down for World War. I'll accept anything for number 2. All right? All right. So now let's do the rest of them. They're all 1812. They're all 1812. The only one that's not 1812 is number 2, General Sherman. All right? So, did anyone get 1 right? Did anyone get 2 right? Did anyone get 3, 4, 5? Anybody get 5 right? All right, let's go. Okay. How about 1 person got 5 right? You got 5? How about 6? Anybody get 6 right? All right, we got a tie here. Come on, 7? All right, you get the book. Come up to me afterwards, and I'll give you a book as a prize. We didn't.
What one? What number? 6?
7. We didn't read the random number, but Just out of curiosity, anybody pick 71? 1812. All right. Okay, let's go on. So, why did we have a war of 1812? Well, there are really 4 reasons. 3 of them right here. One was Great Britain was capturing sailors from some of our merchant ships. And there was a whole problem with commerce back and forth that the British were interfering with. And the British were also supporting the Native Americans in some resistance to our colonies. So those are 3 reasons that are often given. But there's a 4th reason that I think may be even more important, and that is we had just fought Great Britain. We had just fought the British to get them out of the United States, and they were still in Canada. And I think there was still a lot of animosity, a lot of hope maybe that we would get them out of North America completely. We weren't really happy with the British, and we decided to invade Canada and get them out. It didn't work out very well, but anyway, I think those are really the reasons why we started the War of 1812. I'm not going to talk much more about the war because my talk is about life in Cheshire's prisoner of war camps. And now you can probably guess which war we're talking about, the War of 1812. When I told some people that I was going to be talking about Cheshire's prisoner of war camps, they said, "You mean my house?" And so I'm not going to go there. Fortunately, they're not here right now, so they won't get in trouble. But no, I'm not going to be talking about anybody's house in Cheshire today, but I'm going to talk about 1812. Actually, I'm going to be talking about 1814 because that's when the prisoners came here. The reason I know about this is because in my research of different things about Cheshire, I came across this book. It was written by Captain William Hamilton Merritt. He wrote it in 1863, but included in it is his diary from when he was living in Cheshire as a prisoner. Day by day, everything he did. And it gives us a nice glimpse into what it was like to be a prisoner here in Cheshire in 1814. I'm also going to mention a few things from the history of Cheshire, written by Rayner and Petterclerk in 1885. And they knew about the prisoners, and so in their books, they do have a few paragraphs talking about their life. But most of what you're going to hear today comes from Captain Merritt. And I'll tell you more about him as we go along through the presentation. First of all, he was a young man. He was 21, July 1st. And my talk begins in July, really. So he was 21 years old when he was fighting in the War of 1812. And I'm not going to talk a lot about the battles, but I'm going to mention 2. First of all, the Battle of Fort Erie. Over on the right, you can see the British had 4,800 men in the battle, and the United States had 2,800. You can see how many were killed and wounded. What I thought was kind of interesting here is the number captured. So there were a lot of captured men in these various battles. And Captain Merritt ended up being one of them, not in this battle, but in another. There were a lot of people killed on both sides. One of the interesting things about this particular battle is we defeated the British. We had Fort Erie, they stormed it, we defeated them, and then a few months later we abandoned the fort. So it was kind of a battle that really didn't make a lot of sense in the end.
Just like a,
Yeah, just like current events. But the Battle of Lundy's Lane, also known as the Battle of Niagara Falls, fought 25th of July. Remember, he turned 21 earlier in the month. They consider that one of the bloodiest battles of the war. Now, the Fort Erie battle, it was 2 or 3 months while the British took siege of Fort Erie. So all those casualties and stuff happened over 2 or 3 months. The Battle of Lundy's Lane was very short, 1 or 2 days. So there were a lot of casualties, so to speak, in a very short period of time, which is why they may have considered this the bloodiest battle of the war. And that's where he was captured. And in his diary, he says, I was taken prisoner by 6 fellows who were sulking from the fire which then raged with great fury. So in other words, he was fighting for the British, and in his diary, he gets more specific. He says, I was moving from one part of the line to the other, and as he ran through the woods, some Americans jumped out and captured him. And they were hiding, apparently, from the battle, according to his diary. We were all very much fatigued. Many had been for several nights without sleep. We were marched under a strong escort to Buffalo, 24 miles, so that on our arrival, we were completely worn out. The officer who had charge of us, I cannot speak much in favor of. We were sent to Pomeroy's Inn, where we procured a good supper for the first time and took a very comfortable nap on the tables. Well, those of you who've been in the Army know that anytime you get a chance to sleep, you want to sleep. And in today's Army, the same thing happens, I'm sure. So I don't think it was very comfortable sleeping on the table, but it was the first time they got a chance to have some sleep in a long time. From his diary, he lists day by day what's happening. And you can see it got printed he wrote it in longhand, but certainly when it got published in 1863, it got printed. I'm going to sort of highlight some days, not all of them, but just some. I'll start with the 27th. Taken prisoner along with 19 officers and 116 privates. Marched to Major Miller's Tavern, 2 miles from Buffalo, where we had great fare. I saw my Uncle William this morning, who was then residing there. I wrote for my baggage to be sent over. We were paroled for Greenbush. Our guard was, I think the word is they were let go. I think we'll see the end of that sentence in another one. But the word paroled is interesting here. And I'm not sure if you know about the meaning back then. It's a little different today. And I'm going to explain to you what paroled meant. In the War of 1812, there were 2 kinds of parole. If you were an enlisted man with low rank, your parole was simply this. You would be given a paper in which you signed that you promised not to fight anymore, and they sent you home. And the integrity of the soldier back then was, okay, I didn't want to fight anyway. I'll go home and tend to the farm or tend to whatever I had before. And they pretty much didn't fight. In fact, you were kind of scorned if you snuck back to the war and fought. So the enlisted man was just sent home with a promise. However, the high-ranking officers, they had a different procedure. They were sent away to distant towns. And I'm not 100% sure of the exact rationale why one was treated so differently from the other, but they were paroled to different places. And they were usually housed in inns or private homes when they got to that distant place. And they usually lived in kind of a lavish lifestyle. And you're going to hear a lot about that in just a moment. Here's an actual parole document. I'm going to enlarge it so we can look at some of it. It says right here, having this day admitted you to remain a prisoner of war to the United States on parole in the town of Cheshire, within the county of Berkshire. So that's what they kind of looked like when you were captured and paroled. Now, he was paroled to Greenbush, which is right over the county of New York. But something got changed. I'll show you that in a minute. But that's what the actual parole document would have looked like. Why Cheshire? Well, it was far enough away from the battle so they couldn't just get back there in a short amount of time. It was out of state, and it wasn't near a large population center. One of the reasons for that was explained in the 1885 history. It was not deemed safe to parole them at Pittsfield, where lived many avowed Tories and friends of King George. So we had the revolution. Some of the people fought for America, and we had the Tories who were still British and favoring the British. And so they wanted to make sure that when they sent these prisoners, they sent them to a place that was definitely not pro-British. Now, I thought you might find the journey to Cheshire interesting. I did, and so I'm going to outline for you how they got here. By the way, the end of that sentence was, our guard was subsequently dismissed, so they weren't guarded. Again, it was on honor. You were paroled to Greenbush, or you're going to go to Greenbush, and we trust that you will. Here's how they got there. This is the map of New York State, and the red line indicates how they got here. So this is Buffalo, and this is Pittsfield, or Greenbush. And I did a Google Maps thing to see how long it would take. If you were to walk from Buffalo to Greenbush, it's going to take you 106 hours. And Google Maps figures you walk 3 miles an hour. So they didn't walk, but still, remember that 106 hours. Just out of curiosity, you might find something interesting later. So here's how they started. They left on the 28th of July in 3 wagons. They left early in the morning at 6 a.m. and they arrived in Batavia at 9 p.m. So they pretty much had a long day riding in those wagons. You can imagine what it was like riding in those old wagons in 1814. And they went 40 miles that day. They did stop for lunch. So, by the way, Google Maps didn't figure you were going to stop anywhere. You're just walking 3 miles an hour for 100. But they had to stop. They changed horses. There were things that they had to do. On the 29th, we stayed in Batavia. We washed clothes after wearing them for a week while marching and sleeping. We were joined by 5 prisoners taken by Trader Wilcox. He was not a very well-liked guy, according to the diary. All right, on the 30th, we left Batavia at 6 a.m. for Branson, New York. They're now following what was called then the Cherry Valley Turnpike. And that's Route 20, basically. So that's the road that they got, that's the route that they took from that part of New York over to Greenbush. And you can see on this map Route 20 here as it goes around through New York. So on the 31st, we left before breakfast and they arrived at 8 p.m. at Geneva. And it's kind of interesting. They stopped right there at the head of one of the Finger Lakes. And he said, Canandaigua at noon, most beautiful. Lake on the right, old school fellow heard of passing and caught up for a visit. Put up at the inn right on the lake. Growing and handsome village. Sounds like a pretty spot. I've never been to the Finger Lakes, but I imagine it's a beautiful location there. They did 66 miles that day. The next day, they took a stage and they went to Geneva, from Geneva to Ganados. I don't know how to pronounce it, but they basically went from this Finger Lake over to the top of that Finger Lake. And again, they didn't travel completely the whole time. They stopped for lunch. They passed Auburn, New York, which again is right there at the end of the Finger Lake at 1 o'clock and had lunch. Okay, the next day, left at 10 and lunched at Onondaga Hollow and arrived at Manalius. 31 miles that day. He didn't have much to say about it, but they left by stage with 13 the next day to go to Litchfield. Now, I can't imagine how big that stage was, but to have 13 people in it, they must have been riding on the top and up with the driver and, you know, inside and hanging on the back and everything. They did 48 miles. He says that they stayed there a couple days. August 4th and 5th, we stayed with Dr. Prendergast. Now, he knew Dr. Prendergast prior to the war. His diary talks about him being a family friend. This is very interesting. Received every attention by the family. So remember that too, because at the end, you'll find out that there's something very interesting happened with the family there. And finally, well, not finally, but next to the last, they arrived in Albany at 5 p.m. And that was the longest trip they had. They went 83 miles that day. And in his diary, he tells you pretty much why it was they went so far. He said, beautiful country, last stage drove too fast, nearly breaking down. So apparently the driver had a heavy foot, or snapping to the horses or something like that. Okay, so we're almost to where they're supposed to be, but they did stay in Albany for quite a few days. And he tells you in the diary, I visited the museum, I went to the reading room, went to the public gardens. So it was like he was on a vacation, like a tour. Kind of opposite of what I expected when I first heard he was a prisoner of war. Again, they're not guarded. So finally, they left Albany on the 12th and at 4 a.m., and they arrived in Pittsfield at 2 p.m. And that trip was only 39 miles. What he said is, we stopped in Greenbush for breakfast and changed horses. We visited a curious sect called Shaking Quakers. I mean, if you're going to drive through it, we would have done it, right? We would have stopped to see the Quakers, the Shaking Quakers. So they traveled a total of 8 days. They stayed in places, but actually on the road for 8 days. And if you figure they traveled approximately 12 hours a day, they were traveling for 96 hours, which is about what you could do if you walk 24 hours a day to Buffalo. All right. Some things here are interesting. They left Albany at 4 o'clock. We had crossed the ferry. That must be the Hudson River, right? Proceeded through Greenbush. Breakfast, had changed horses. Passed Lebanon at 11 o'clock. Visited the springs. I've never visited Lebanon Springs. Walked up the hill, a most charming prospect. There is a curious sect here called the Shaking Quakers who never marry. Arrived in Pittsfield at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Called on Major Melville, the agent for prisoners. And this is where he got changed. Gave in our paroles, signed new ones for Cheshire. Dined, were conveyed to our place of destination in light wagons. And so apparently for some reason, they moved his parole from Greenbush to Cheshire. He arrived in Cheshire and met with Captain Brown. Captain Brown was the most famous man in Cheshire at the time. It was actually his son, for example, that went with the cheese to Washington, D.C. Captain Brown had the biggest house in Cheshire. Captain Brown's house is no longer with us, but I'm going to show you a photograph of it in a minute. And from Captain Brown's house, which is across from the fire station, you could look all the way to the Hoosick River. He owned all that land all the way from there to the Hoosick River. So he was the most important man, and certainly because he was a captain, that's where they were told to report. So let's take a look now at the different places where they stayed. And I want to point out to you that they paid $5 a week for board. So these people who were putting them up were happy to have them because they were making quite a bit of money for that time frame. And the servants had to pay $2 each. They were put up in Hall's Tavern. There's a list of names of the men that were put there. And Hall's Tavern, I wish my pointer would have worked better, but that's Hall's Tavern. I'm going to sit for a minute while I do this part. Hall's Tavern's still with us today. It's across from the Baptist Church. It was built in 1804, and it's still a beautiful home today. The next place that people were put up was at Captain Brown's. Captain Brown's is that house, and that's what was across from the fire station. It became the Cheshire Inn. It was a very beautiful home, very large. A lot of people were able to be housed there. That's about the oldest picture I have of it. But like I said, he owned the land all the way from there to the Hoosick River, and he had beautiful gardens along the way. He actually diverted part of Kitchen Brook to water his garden, so he had quite an elaborate spread. A bunch were put up at Barclays. Now, this is one thing. I went to the Registry of Deeds. I had never heard of a Barclay in Cheshire. I went through the Registry of Deeds last week, and I could not find a single piece of property in Cheshire listed under Barclay. So I think that was a mistyped, or the person couldn't read his writing and thought it was Barclay. I think it was supposed to be Barker's. And this is Ezra Barker's house in Cheshire. And that's not there anymore. But you all know where it is. One of the Bedard brothers lives there now. It's right next to the Bedard brothers dealership up on the hill. It was a very old house built in 1785 and torn down, I think, probably in the 60s or 70s. I don't know exactly when. Okay. Another group of prisoners was sent to, it says, a house over the meadow about a half mile away. And I believe they were sent to Medad King's Tavern, which again is no longer there. But if you picture sort of where maybe the Dollar General is, or a little further past that point, I believe that's where that was. And finally, Mr. Rowe, Captain Salisbury, and Lieutenant Major Banks were at Brown's 2 miles off. So that house was up on Jenks Road. And that was the last place listed in his diary where prisoners were kept. So those were the prisons in town. According to his diary, there were a total of 46 in and about the village at that time. Walcott's Inn was one of the places that they stayed. I must have skipped that one, Walcott's Inn was one of the places that they were housed. And that's no longer with us. But that was built in 1795, and it was changed to a private home. And here's what that home looked like. And that's the house at the red light that they tried to auction off a couple weeks ago, known as the Beechwood. Nobody bought, the bank bought it back. And when I show people this picture, they can't believe, actually, you could hit the lights now, Carol, sorry. When I show this to people, notice the chimneys, the two chimneys here, and this chimney here. When they converted it to this house, they kept all the framework, all the bones of the house the same. And he just changed the windows. So this window became a double, that one in the middle became this fancy thing. And he added a mansard roof, which changed the roof line completely. He put these bay windows down at the bottom where they had been windows in the past. So basically the same structure, just transformed to look like a beautiful house. It's too bad it went into disrepair. Okay, so somehow I skipped that first one. That was Walcott's Tavern, and that's where he was. That's where he had his meals. He was actually put up at Hall's Tavern, but he had his meals at Walcott's. Okay, what happened in the first few days? Well, first of all, on the 13th, the day after they got to Cheshire, his servant arrived. He had left them in Albany, apparently, for whatever reason. And on the 14th, part of our company went to church. We heard the Baptist minister preach. That would have been Leland, by the way. His discourse was on everything, could not comprehend his meaning. An abundance of fine girls there. That's a strain of thought that's going to come up fairly often in his diary. I know why he didn't understand the preacher's sermon. He wasn't listening. He was watching the girls. The next day, we spent the day reading and playing cricket, which is our principal diversion. Had half an hour's chat with Miss Brown. The remainder of the officers arrived today. On the 18th, I hired a horse and took a ride with Dr. Roper around the country, which is a very rough and hilly. It is nevertheless fertile. They make a great quantity of cheese here. We were famous for our cheese, no doubt about it. All right, what do the daily routines look like? Well, on the 25th, he says we had pleasant weather. I had been here for 1 month. I was made a prisoner a long time, it appears to me. We read newspapers, we strolled, we returned and enjoyed a good dinner. That was a lot of the days, just like that. The next day, took a long walk on the mountain. I wonder if he hiked up all the way to Greylock. Captain Lauren arrived from Albany. We played cricket in the afternoon. I received the Albany papers. This Sunday, we visited with friends in the evening. A number of ladies assembled at the house to hear Mr. Warren play the flute. And on the 28th, I thought this was interesting. Heavy rain. Spent the afternoon with Captain Dawson. Partied in the evening. Heard many anecdotes, particularly of Mrs. Norton's affairs. I tried finding out who that Mrs. Norton was, but I never was able to come up with anything. But it says it was rained so much it carried off the cotton manufactory at Adamstown. So one of the mills along Hoosick must have got damaged during that rainstorm. Employed part of the day in writing, did not attend the divine service as usual, rather a dull day, rode out in the afternoon. Captain Potham left me his horse to ride whenever I thought proper. Well, that was nice. Somebody gave him a horse, and so now he can go about as he wishes. Did some fishing in a beautiful clear brook that runs by the place. That's either Kitchen Brook or the Hoosick. I'm not sure which, but apparently it was a nice fishing brook at the time. Took a long ride in the morning with Mr. Rowe of the Navy. We visited Mr. Mills, the wagon maker, and played cricket in the afternoon. You see the pattern here. Go for a ride, play some cricket, come back and have a nice dinner. We played whist, an old British game to kill time. And they started having horse races. Now, you see the word dancing there. This has become a very popular thing to them now. Apparently, they are going to start having dances almost every Saturday evening. And the fine girls of Cheshire were going to start attending some of these dances. We were all in an unusual flow of spirits in the morning. It was sadly and most effectually curbed at 5 o'clock in the afternoon by the death of poor Robbins. So he died. He's the only British prisoner I've heard of that died in Cheshire. In the history of Cheshire, they talk about his gravestone and that there's a nice engraving on it about His Majesty's soldier having died far from home and so on. And I have searched every cemetery in town and cannot find a gravestone with that inscription on it, because I was just curious where it might be. So if any of you can answer that question, that's one of the unknowns about my talk, is where poor Robbins is buried here in Cheshire. Next day, reading since my last. So here's an interesting thing. He lists the books that he's been reading. I've never read any of these, but he was an avid reader. Rose at 6 o'clock, took a long walk with Captain Brown and Landon to the new glass house. So in 1814, we had started making glass in Cheshire, down by, just over the bridge by the town, by the post office, just over the bridge into what some people known as Scrabbletown. It would be on Main Street, and they were experimenting with making glass. It was actually the first glass factory that wasn't along the old coast. The first glass factory inland. And I mentioned it in my book, Made in Cheshire. It didn't last very long. I don't know exactly how much glass they actually made, but it did burn down and it never got rebuilt. But they went down and took a look at it. I forgot to point this out to you. A new pair of quotes came, whatever it is, came today. Anybody know what that is? It's a game. That's it. Ring toss. So they must have ordered it. Not Amazon. No, I don't think so. That wasn't the only thing they ordered. In his diary, a couple days later, this arrived. So they were able to get what they wanted, apparently. They all had money. Now, on August 24th, the British burned Washington. That was one of the questions, I think, on the quiz. And I thought you might find it interesting because in his diary, he mentions that. He mentions it on the 27th. Mr. Foster brought a report from Pittsfield of Lord Hill having taken possession of Washington. So 3 days is what it took for that news to reach Cheshire. Notice, to celebrate the event, so the British soldiers were pretty happy about that. And I think it was one of the things that annoyed the people in Cheshire because they were already drinking and partying way too much. And when that happened, they did celebrate. The honeymoon started to get over. And as far as them living in Cheshire and being welcomed, different events that celebrating the taking of Washington was one of them. And I'm going to tell you about a few more. He took a long ride. He played billiards. He strolled about and read, and at last drowned my cares in the arms of Morpheus. A party kept on drinking until 2 o'clock in the morning, to the great annoyance of the community. They drank a lot. In his diary, he talks quite often about these late night parties. The militia firing muskets till 2, that would be in the afternoon, as they were passing to a general review, they were going up to Windsor. We, in retaliation, sang God Save the King, Rule Britannia, and all the patriotic songs we could think of. Disturbed our comrades at Walcott's, for which they were about, petitioning for our removal. So imagine you have the militia who are fighting for America, marching past this in center of Cheshire, and you got these British soldiers up on the lawn singing British songs. I'm sure it wasn't it didn't make them very happy here in town. Pleasant weather. Rode into the country. An affair took place between Lieutenant Hicks of the Royal Navy and a citizen. Hicks giving him a good thrashing for kicking his dog. Hicks was arrested early this morning, taken before 2 justices of the peace, bound over to a pier, and refusing to give bail, he was sent to the jail in Lenox. The county jail at the time was in Lenox. So you started having little scuffles between the prisoners and the people in town. On the 31st and Halloween, the servants all had a drunken frolic. We established a band under the patronage of Jimmy Brown and so on. It began with a concert. Dancing was kept up until 12 o'clock. We then set off fireworks in commemoration of Guy Fawkes Day. That's the British holiday when they thwarted the storming of something in London. So it was a British holiday. Our party was not so large as we expected, owing to the bad state of the weather. However, it passed off very well, about 10 or 12 ladies. And as the spell was broken, they, finding nothing dangerous in British officers, promised to attend in the future. Balls, and therefore proposed to be given every fortnight. In the evening, we had a grand ball, 16 or 18 ladies being present. Passed off very agreeably. They are now to be established every fortnight. Pittsfield ladies were prevented from coming because of bad weather. I don't think the men in Cheshire now were very happy about the ladies in Cheshire falling for these rich, handsome, young British soldiers. That's the way they would have looked in their dress uniforms. And in the history of Cheshire, she talks about, the ladies talk about how nice the men looked and how attentive the ladies in town were. Rowe and Crosswick sought as wives, daughters of two of the patriots here in town. Rowe was the more fortunate. He actually married one of the women in town. And Rowe, according to Merritt, he had all his boat crew killed or wounded, and himself on the point of losing his scalp. An Indian had hold of his hair when an officer saved him. He is a small, good-looking young man, quick-tempered, high-spirited, very liberal, and good-hearted. So apparently he was a nice gentleman. The only one that got married in Cheshire of these British prisoners that I was able to determine. So another thing that they did that annoyed everyone was the people in Hall's Tavern one day strung a wire across from the tavern to the Baptist church. And that's mentioned in the history of Cheshire. I'm not going to read that paragraph, but it tells you about the wire strung across. And then at midnight, they decided to pull on the bell. And that was the signal, the call to arms. So when the people of the village heard that, they didn't ignore it. They got dressed and they came out with their muskets and their full regalia and found out that it was the drunken British soldiers in Hall's Tavern pulling the wire. So another thing they did, which they weren't supposed to do, was they had certain limits. They were told they could go this far and not any further. But according to the history of Cheshire, they didn't stop at those limits. If there was a lady they wanted to visit, they just kept on going. If it was a place they wanted to visit, they just kept on going. And like it said in the history, many a sly flirtation was carried on. In the evening, we had a grand ball, 16 or 18 ladies being present. A very wet, disagreeable day. In the evening, the inhabitants of Cheshire had a ball in opposition to ours. Invited one of our officers to their ball. Requested him, though, not to dance. Gave offense to part of the ladies who left with him. So think about that. It's a Cheshire ball, Cheshire men having a ball. They invite a British soldier. They tell him he can't dance. And the ladies get upset with the British men and decide to leave with him. That pretty much broke the straw of the back of the people in Cheshire. And they wrote this letter to the magistrate. We, the subscribers, inhabitants of the town of Cheshire, supposing that you have the power to control or remove the British prisoners now located in Cheshire, think proper to state that they have conducted themselves in such a manner as to render their longer stay in this place highly improper. When, from their repeated and flagrant violations of the law and order, the lives and property of the community are jeopardized, it becomes our duty to state that their society is insupportable and that they cannot remain here. I think the ladies who were attracted to the British soldiers probably had a big part in determining that the men in Cheshire didn't want these British soldiers around anymore. So the war finally ended. They were here from actually the first soldiers came in May. He came in July. But the first soldiers came in May, and the Treaty of Ghent was signed in February. So they were here in 1814, and the war ended in February of 1850. So they were here about a half a year, 3/4 of a year. And they were released to go home. Now, on his way home, remember I told you on his way there, he stopped and met with Dr. Prendergast and received every attention of the family. On the way home, he married the daughter. And so I'm not sure what attention he got from her, but Catherine Prendergast. This is a love letter that he had sent to her, and I'm not going to try to read it, but I'll tell you that he wrote it the first day that he was captured. Dear Catherine, you as doubt will be very much surprised in finding me at this place. I had the misfortunes of falling in the hands of the Americans in the action of the 25th July at Lundy's Lane. He wrote a letter on February 9th. This is just before he got the war ended and he got released. Time never can efface the impression your delightful image has made on my fond heart. If I should be separated from you for years, I will ever remain the same as you left me. So they had a nice life here, but they were still separated from their families and their loved ones. So it wasn't all, there was still some suffering. This is Captain Merritt. A stamp was made in his honor. By the time he got back to Canada, he became a wealthy man in Canada. He actually helped to create one of the canals in Canada. He was well known in his area. I wasn't able to find a picture or a drawing or a painting, I should say, of him as a young man. But remember, he was 21 when he was brought here, and he died in 18. What did it say? He died in 1862. So he lived to be an old man in Canada. So that's my talk about the prisoners of Cheshire. Didn't know how long it would take, but it's practically about 50 minutes. So do you have any questions? Yes.
The house on Jenks Road, is it still there?
Yes.
Is that big yellow house on Jenks Road?
It's, I believe, where the Hitters live on Jenks Road.
Oh, it's where the Hitters live.
Mhm. Nicholas Brown owned it in the early days. Now, I should tell you this. We had a couple of soldiers here from the Revolution as well. They were actually housed in a house up on Windsor Road. And if you look at one of the old maps of Cheshire, I forget which date it is, might be the map of 1876, that house is labeled British soldiers from the Revolution housed here. But that is about all I know about it. So I focused my talk today on the prisoners from 1812. Yep. Okay, so laying around reading, having a life of liberty and not suffering in captivity the way most prisoners of war suffer.
Was Captain Welland born in Canada?
Who?
Captain Welland, the prison.
Captain Merritt.
Merritt?
Captain Merritt was born in Canada, and he fought around the Buffalo, Niagara Falls area, and then he went back to Canada after he got released from Cheshire.
It wasn't part of the British Army.
And you can find his diary online the same way I found it by Googling Captain Merritt.
In Connecticut, there's a Merritt Parkway. Does that have anything to do with?
I don't think so. No, must be somebody else. Yeah. Okay. So I have a book for you. Come on up. The little bookmarks, you're welcome to take those if you want them. Again, my email address, if you want it, ever ask me a question, is emery395@gmail.com. And I appreciate you coming. Thank you.